The mission is to bring down the mob. But it doesn't get mafia boss John Gotti.
Not guilty.
Now the pressure is on the FBI.
The only way you're going to put him in jail, you have to capture his discussions.
Gotti is finally caught on tape and then betrayed by his underboss.
We played chess, and he lost.
It took them 7 rats that killed 100 people to finally frame me.
Scenes there from a 2013 documentary concerning the boss of the Gambino crime family, John Gotti. As we welcome you back into America's Forum, we should note that after many failed attempts by authorities to take down that organized crime ring, Gotti was finally caught, tried, and convicted in 1992. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, and after being diagnosed with throat cancer in 1998, he died 4 years later in prison. Against that backdrop, let's go further in depth with a man who spent more than 30 years reporting on crime in his own hometown of Philadelphia and got up close and personal with those who apparently are part of the scene. From Newsmax, New York, we welcome in George Anastasia. George is the author of the new book, Gotti's Rules, the story of John Jr. and the demise of the American Mafia. George, Ford and I are so happy to have you here on America's Forum. What is it like to write all this history of this particular crime family?
Well, I think the mafia, the American mafia, has become part of pop culture almost because of Mario Puzo, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese. And I think most Americans have a frame of reference. And that helps me as a writer because I think there's an interest in the topic. And the topic is so rich, you can't make it up any better than it is.
George, you talk about the demise of the mob and particularly the Gambino crime family. What has led to that after it's taken so long for them to build it up? How did the power just come out from underneath basically the American mob in general?
Well, I think a couple different things. One, much more sophisticated law enforcement, the RICO law, electronic surveillance, the death of Omerta, the Code of Silence, the Witness Protection Program. And there's another fundamental issue, I think. Second and third generation Italian Americans, the best and the brightest, are doctors, lawyers, and educators, and the mob is scraping the bottom of the gene pool. You take a guy like Gotti Sr., Gotti Jr., in the 1940s, 1950s, they could have never been the boss of a crime family. They would have been a knee buster, which is what Gotti Sr. actually was, but they would have never risen to the top of the organization. So all of those factors have contributed, I think, to the demise of the organization.
When we hear this, and of course your new book, as I understand it, you talk about mob families with rules. What kind of rules are you talking about, George?
Well, I mean, it's called Gotti's Rules because the story of the Gambino Gotti crime family that I wrote comes through the eyes and the experiences of John A. Light, who was an enforcer for Gotti Jr., born in Queens, Albanian, so he could never be a made member, but he really, in the beginning, bought into the whole concept of organized crime. And what he came to see over the course of almost 20 years working for and killing for the Gottis was there were a set of rules that applied to everybody except the Gottis. And it was kind of a hypocrisy in the organization. That's where the title of the book comes from. And the rules, for example, one of the rules were no one is to deal drugs. If you deal drugs, you're subject to murder, to death. However, if you are dealing drugs, you got to kick up part of what you're earning to the boss. That was the hypocrisy of the Gottis. A. Light says everybody in the organization was dealing drugs, he among them, and everybody was kicking up to the Gottis. So it's the rules applied to everyone except the Gottis, and that kind of undermined the structure of the organization.
You know, although that organized crime is basically on the demise, we may have new forms of crime within the government themselves, but why are Americans really so fascinated with the ins and outs of how mob life works, particularly with the Gambino crime family? I mean, heck, every time I looked up in the newspaper, they were always on page 6 or page 1, so Americans still love the mob. Why do you think that is?
I think it's part of our nature. I think Americans have always been fascinated with the outlaw. Whether it was Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Al Capone, Vito Corleone, there's a fascination with the rogue, the person that operates outside the law. And I think Mario Puzo, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese have contributed to making it into a pop culture and giving everybody a frame of reference. So I think that's the reason for the fascination. And I think a lot of people still believe the mafia was what it was in the 1950s and 1960s. That's not the case any longer. It's not the monolithic institution that it was back then. And in terms of the underworld, it's not even the major player anymore. You've got drug gangs, you've got Russian organized crime, Asian organized crime. All of those are, I think, you could argue, as bigger players in the underworld than the American mafia.
I have a couple of minutes left, George, and Ford already made mention of my previous calling in Congress and all the jokes about crime in Washington. So I'm a recovering congressman, right. But I had occasion to talk once upon a time to a very prominent prosecutor who had gone after a lot of mob figures. And I said, don't you live in fear? He said, no, no, no. The mob accepts this as part of the price of doing business. But don't ever get in a situation where you're beholden to them. Now, I offer that premise to you. Being close to these families, writing about them, did you ever fear for your personal safety?
One time I had a problem covering the Philadelphia mob. It was in the mid-1990s. And the boss of the crime family back then was a guy named John Stanfa, who had been born and raised in Sicily. And in Sicily, they kill prosecutors, they kill judges. If you're not with them, you're against them. That's the only time I had a serious problem. He put a hit out on me. I wasn't aware of it till after the fact. But again, it was an aberration. I think it was that Sicilian mentality. American mafia figures understand that to go after a reporter creates more problems than it solves. And I think what you said is accurate. If you don't cross the line, if you don't get in business with them, they understand where you're coming from. And in terms of what I've done for 30, 35 years, I kind of come with the territory.
George, we got 30 seconds left. I got to ask you a big question. Yeah. Mobsters that we all know watch movies. My question is, modern mobsters, what do they like better, Goodfellas or Godfather? Because I got to know.
Goodfellas is the more realistic. Godfathers is a classic movie, but it's fiction. Donnie Brasco is another one I think you got to add to that list as realistic.
Oh, you got to know what's... I'm sorry, I'm just channeling Brando now. Hey, George Anastasia, thanks so much for your time. Again, the name of the book, Gotti's Rules. You might want to pick that up and read it. It's just a suggestion. Seriously, thanks to George Anastasia, the author of that book, and thanks to Ford O'Connell. We will have Ford back and continue on America's Forum in mere moments. But right now, we need to step aside to update you on what's happening in this Newsmax Now update.